welcome back to Book and Page, and I hope you are ready to talk about some things. Because, man, do we have a lot to talk about. Especially the fact that my shirt's shrunk in the wash, and I'm so sad. But let's jump into Beowulf, shall we? So we are getting towards the end. We have officially now started the battle between Beowulf and the dragon. Let's see how we actually got there. So last time we heard a small bit about the dragon. There was a time skip. Hey, a dragon's here. Something about a thief. We're going to get that in a little more detail. It turns out a thief has broken into the dragon's hoard. But this was done because he seems to be some sort of slave or on the outs with his lord, and he's trying to make peace by offering some treasure to him. Too bad he woke the dragon while doing it. And too bad for us, the manuscript that we actually have of Beowulf is badly damaged in this section. So while there are bits and pieces of lines we can pick up, there is a chunk that we're missing. When we come back in, we actually get a history lesson on the hoard itself. It turns out it was buried by the last survivor of some sort of ancient army, who then wept over the terrible nature of humanity and then died. The dragon then arrived at the hoard and took it over because, hey, it's free real estate. What you gonna do? So then, after this history lesson, we bought back to the thief and Beowulf and the dragon. So what we brought back to is the fact that the thief woke the dragon up. Dragon realized he had a cup missing, started torching everything. Because obviously that's what you do when a single cup's gone, right? Beowulf is then informed of the dragon's rage and the fact that his own hull has been torched, and he decides he has to face the dragon. But he's actually not sure he wants to take his entire army to do so. The reasons for this aren't super clear, but we can insinuate a little bit from the discussion that follows, because we then get more of the history lesson of Beowulf becoming king. Why this was not before the dragon, who even knows? So we get the lesson about how Beowulf survived the death of Hygelac in battle, was offered kingship by Hygelac's wife, and actually said no, he would support Hygelac's son, his own nephew. This went about as well as to be expected when Hygelac's son then died in battle and Beowulf ultimately became king, helping to ultimately defeat the Swedes that had killed both Hygelac and his son, though indirectly because he basically supported somebody else for king in Sweden. Who even knows what's going on? So what we actually get is Beowulf then selecting 12 men that will come with him and the thief to find... 11 men, if I'm correct. Because we end up with 13. Tolkien, right? But he selects his companions and forces the thief to show them where the dragon hoard actually is. And once they're there, Beowulf then sits all his people down, and he talks about a lot of things. We get the history of his family, which ultimately turns out it's kind of a sad history. How that's connected to issues of revenge within society. The battle between the Geatish and the Swedes, which seemed to have been going on for a really long time, and his own sort of heroics when he was younger, most notably the killing of, I almost had Galahad, that's a completely different story. Grendel and his kin, his mother. God, I hate this thing sometimes. Just so much going on. So after this entire discussion, Beowulf then boasts that he will fight down the dragon and won't give a step. He's gonna wear some battle gear because dragons breathe fire, so it's not really fair to go hand to hand with something that's not gonna go hand to hand with you. And off Beowulf goes to fight the dragon. We actually do get the first section of a fight where they seem to be pretty equal with each other, though they have to take a break partway through, then go back at it, and it turns out the companions picked by Beowulf were the wrong companions for the most part, because all but one of them flees. Yeah, it's a lot happening in these sections. It's actually a longer set of 4 sections in the text. It seems to be a little out of order, and at this point in time, there are a few things I want to talk about that I've had to draw visual aids for. But to start, I would like to address the literary references we're seeing here, both to past literature for Beowulf and future-wise, and then a discussion briefly about that revenge problem. Then we'll talk about dragons and hordes, and that's where visual aids are going to come in. I'll apologize in advance, I can't draw worth anything, so sorry. Especially to that dragon I attempted to draw. Yes, let's start with some textual references. Now, I've already mentioned Tolkien both in this video and briefly the last video, and this is because Beowulf is a big part of where Tolkien got a lot of, at least The Hobbit, from. There is actually a translation of Beowulf you can get by Tolkien, and I think that would be absolutely fascinating to read his translation against The Hobbit. But the big things to pull out, especially if you're reading both of them, either of them, or writing a paper comparing the two, is that the thief obviously is reference to Bilbo, him serving as the 13th member of the company. Super cool. And I could be wrong, it could actually be 12 companions, because ultimately in The Hobbit we have 12 dwarves, Bilbo as the 13th, and then Gandalf as this sort of nebulous 14th member. So Beowulf could actually be almost a Gandalf figure here. But ultimately, he also serves as a Thorin figure because, you know, death of the great king. Other references, Bilbo does in fact grab a cup from the Horde when he first steals into Smaug's lair, which seems to be what's taken from the Horde here. For the most part, that's where a lot of the comparisons end, unless you want to get into the nitty-gritty. For example, Bilbo is despised. By Thorin, at least, and at least in the movies. Less so in the books, where Thorin's a big pompous dude who just really likes speeches, and likes constantly, you know, talking. In the movies, he's a little bit more head up his ass. And ultimately the thief here is despised because he's brought the dragon's wrath down on the community, and he also seems to be lower in the status ladder than anybody else already, so we might be seeing some differences there. To say that Bilbo is the thief one-on-one and the Hobbit is a representation of Beowulf, you can't really say that either. There is some major differences. For example, Bilbo doesn't go into the mountain on his own. He's not trying to make peace with anybody. He's been contractually obligated to do this by a contract that he signed himself, and there's a whole, you know, adventure before that point. So, I mean, ultimately, yeah. Yeah. So, yes, there's definitely some Tolkien here. It's really obvious where he got inspiration for a lot of these things, but you always have to keep in mind that you never fully have original ideas. You're always going to take bits and pieces from things happening around you, and things that you read. And in fact, Beowulf, within a very close section of these Tolkien references that we now perceive, you can also perceive a reference to Norse mythology. I just really wanted to show off this book, but there is actually a reference here. So ultimately, while Beowulf is talking about the family history he has, we end up discussing some revenge issues. So, pardon me as I massacre these names as well. I was no more hated to him while he lived. This is speaking to Higelac, who he's saying took him in as a child. a man in his stronghold than any of his sons. Okay, this is in reference to Hygelac father. Heribert, Hithikin, and my own Hygelac. So that's like the Hygelac he ended up serving under. Yeah. So we're looking at Hygelac and his brothers. For the eldest, undeservedly, a deathbed was made by the deeds of a kinsman after Heathcliff, so one of the other brothers, with his horn bow struck down his own dear lord with an arrow. He missed his mark and killed his kinsman, one brother to another with a bloody shaft. That was a fight beyond settling, a sinful crime, shattering the heart, yet it had to be that a nobleman lost his life unavenged. So what's being referenced here is the fact that Hygelac's brother killed their older brother. But because, one, it was an accident, and two, it was an accident between brothers, the family then can't take revenge, right? You can't start killing off your own family members. And Beowulf goes on to compare this to what we talked about earlier, which is you can't have revenge for the death of somebody who was a criminal. So he ultimately compares it to an old man who saw his son die on the gallows because he was a criminal. That old man then can't go and get revenge because the young man's death was caused by his own actions and his own criminal actions. This is the revenge problem. And we'll talk a little bit about that further, but the reference to the arrow can actually be found in Norse mythology. Most specifically, it's ultimately a sign of Ragnarok coming. So what this is referencing is the story of Loki, Balder, and Hodor. So what this actually is Balder the Beautiful, son of Odin and Frigga. Very beautiful, fantastic god. Everybody loves him. And he starts having bad dreams that he is going to die. And Frigga, his mother, freaks out and goes around the world basically demanding that everything swear they'll never hurt her son, Balder. And you know what? Sure, everything swears they won't hurt Balder, except Loki realizes mistletoe hasn't been brought in. So he disguises himself as an old woman and asks Frigga about mistletoe. And Frigga tells him that mistletoe is too young to swear and is harmless anyways. You can see where this is going. Ultimately, mistletoe will be Balder's downfall. And this is actually done because he's become magically immune to everything. So the other gods have quite started a game where they just chuck things at Balder and watch it bounce off of him. I don't know why. So Loki, again disguised as this old woman, ends up making an arrow out of mistletoe and gives it to Balder's brother Hodor, who is blind. Hodor's been sort of feeling left out about this game. He wants to have fun, and he seems to take it as an idea that he's praising Balder for his indestructibility by chucking deadly things at him. So this old woman, who's Loki, says, I will help you aim, and you'll have fun and join in, and it'll be great. And of course, Hodor ultimately kills Balder with the mistletoe arrow. Now the difference here is that pretty much everyone immediately recognizes that it was Loki's doing. So, like, no blame falls on Hodor. But we are seeing this connection between a brother killing a brother with an arrow completely by accident. This brother was aiming at something else and accidentally hit his brother, while Hodor was misinformed about exactly what was happening. So here, well, the punishment ends up being on Loki, and it is kind of an excellent, awful punishment. But we also see then the end of the world coming. And that's a fantastic reference coming into the end of Beowulf. The end of the world, of course, is Ragnarok, because ultimately a bunch of other things are going to happen, and then Balder comes back from the dead as sort of the only surviving of the Norse mythology gods, and with two humans that also survive. says mythology has to be straightforward. But getting this reference here, we shouldn't suddenly feel very, very tense about what's happening. Because we've suddenly got a reference very directly to the Norse mythology leading into Ragnarok and the end of the world. And Beowulf is bringing this up at a point where he is well aware he's likely not going to survive this battle. We have to keep in mind again, he has been king for 50 years. He's like Hrothgar at this point in time. He could be upwards of 70, 80. Yet he's still going to go into battle, and into battle alone. The revenge problem also comes up here. First and foremost, we have seen a couple versions of death that can't be avenged. That is a family member accidentally killing a family member, or there's possibility of the fact that if you kill a family member, you can't be avenged anyways. We did meet somebody in Hrothgar's hall who killed his own brother. So it might simply be that death within families can't be avenged. And, of course, the death of criminals, though we've seen that go off the rail because Grendel's mother tried to avenge her son. She was wrong in trying to do so, but ultimately tried to do it anyways, and was ultimately defeated and killed by Beowulf. We're about to see another death that can't be revenged. What happens if both combatants die? What happens if both combatants are actually the end of a lineage in and of themselves? The dragon and Beowulf are going to take each other out. There's not going to be any vengeance after this point, but we're also going to see that right from the beginning, well, enough damage has been caused anyways. There's a problem with vengeance here, which is we put so much stock in it that ultimately we end up starting to go off the rails a little bit. That actually happens with Hygelac father. We're then told that he becomes listless. He doesn't bother taking care of anything. He lays on the couch and weeps until he dies. That's not a good thing. Thankfully, Hygelac ended up, it seems, to be a relatively good king until he died early. His son died early, and then Beowulf, we've certainly been told, is a good king. But we're actually building up to a problem here, and that is the dragon problem. Now, the big reason why I've got visual aids here is to try and help explain a very strange idea if you've never run into this idea before, and that is the use of a ship's hull. Let's do this. Okay, so, visual aid number 1. Here we have a ship. And here we have the hull of the ship flipped over. The mast, of course, and sail have been removed. Why would you flip this ship over? Well, ultimately, for a lot of seafaring groups, especially those who are seeking other lands to inhabit, there are 2 major reasons to flip a ship over. Visual aid number 2. See, you actually have other uses for a ship's hull. Now, a lot of different sea companies, Vikings included, but keeping in mind, we're in that weird area that seems to be between Scandinavian countries and Britain, because this is written in Old English. But what they used to actually do is they would land somewhere, decide it was someplace they wanted to stay, they would remove the mast and the sails, flip their hull over, and that would actually become the roof of their hulls. Now, this sort of sent a message both to themselves and everybody else that they were staying. They no longer have the ships to be able to leave, right? But the other use of a ship's hull is actually to make these hoards, almost. They're burial mounds. And you have for sure seen pictures of these if you've seen pictures of Scandinavia or pictures of Britain, England especially. So basically, you flip it over, the hollowed out inside is where then you put the body and all the grave goods. So 2 absolutely fascinating uses that you'll start noticing are sort of diverging. We have a use for life and a use in death. Now, The burial mounds might not immediately pop into your mind because they actually look different now. You're not seeing a ship's hull. You're in fact seeing something like this. It's just a grassy hill. The burial mound part is the fact that it's kind of just popping up out of nowhere. But Beowulf's story here is providing another possibility than sort of the grassy hill. We could have the grassy hill, or I told you I'm bad at drawing. Is that not a beautiful, beautiful dragon? This probably needs a lot of explaining. Okay. You see, what we actually have with the horde happening is this concept of dragons having been people. And we kind of get this idea both ways in Beowulf. The dragon could be a separate entity who's simply come in, but the stories we're getting here, and sort of the off-the-wall history that seems to have nothing to do with what we're talking about, are painting this idea of humans becoming dragons. And this can happen visually with then this horde, because it can be a burial mound, and everything that's hoarded in it is, well, it's used as much as a dragon's hoard is. We've been told that one of the main problems with the dragon and the hoarding of all the gold is the dragon never uses it. It just sits there and sits there and sits there, and it doesn't benefit anybody. This should be highlighted by the fact that the entire story we've been attributing good kings as ring givers, and bad kings as the greedy type who keep all their gold to themselves. Bad kings are like dragons here. But what we run into then isn't a burial mound like a dragon hoard. Aren't we seeing somebody who is dead and thus can't use any of this being buried ultimately with all of this treasure? Aren't we seeing these burial mounds turn into dragon hoards because suddenly you can't use that treasure, it doesn't benefit anybody else, but there's also that social and maybe even supernatural fear of disturbing those burial mounds. It's not like you want to go in to a tomb and just start taking things out of it. Some people are going to realize, yes, and it's going to be a lot like the thieves who want to make money or need to make money or need something for their family to survive, that we're seeing the invasion of these hordes and the removal of their bits and pieces. But the dragon then turning around and torching everybody for it, well, isn't that the idea we sort of spread about tombs, right? The curses that will follow you, or sometimes even living family. If you found out your dad's tomb had been broken into, you might be a little mad, and you might want to go after the people who did it. So what we're actually seeing here is a divergence in practically all the material things that we can use. We see a divergence in the use of the ship hull between the life-giving hull that you can build and, well, the tomb and the service to death. Same too with the end result. You could have an untouched burial mound that simply becomes covered in grass and flowers and another living thing in the landscape that speaks back to your history. Or we could be seeing a dragon horde in the making. And this is particularly interesting because Beowulf and the dragon are paired up, but we have another pairing as well. Now, Beowulf and the dragon are actually paired up very directly. We see the same type of words being used for the two of them. They're ultimately both called creatures. But we're also told that they're both afraid of each other. They recognize the damage they can cause. Each of the two hostile ones stood in horror of the other. But again, same words. Hostile ones. They're both called creatures. And we even have a comparison between the dragon as a hoard warden, so a guarder of all of this wealth, and Beowulf as a folk guardian, a guardian of all his people. So we are seeing a vaguely frightening comparison between the dragon and Beowulf. We've had this discussion about becoming the monster, and Beowulf is practically one-to-one compared to this dragon. They're in fear of each other's power. They're actually fighting each other almost to the same degree. They have the same power structure. They both need to take breaks. Ultimately, Beowulf and the dragon are evenly matched, and that might be a concern for us. But the difference being, we're told, the hoard warden versus the folk guardian. Beowulf is here to fight for his people, and that actually might be the big reason he hasn't taken a full army with him. He's likely very aware that his own power is going to be a better bet than losing all of his men in an army to the dragon. He picked companions, but they've actually run away. But we'll see one come back in who is there to help. And maybe it's the fact that Beowulf does have companions that really differentiates from the dragon. And really differentiates Beowulf from the last survivor. And this is a really important part for us to mention, because we get it right at the start of this section. We have a thief who comes in, the manuscript goes a little unreadable, and then we come back being told that the hoard was placed there by one surviving man. And we get the lament. It's actually fairly well known, even separately, the lament of the last survivor. And this is the man who's buried all of this gold. He's the only one left of this ancient nation's army. And he speaks, "Hold now, O thou earth, for heroes cannot the wealth of man. Lo, from you long ago, those good ones first obtained it." So, speaking to the fact that gold is taken from the earth. "Death in war and awful deadly harm have swept away all of my people who have passed from life and left the joyful hall. Now I have none to bear the sword or burnish the bright cup, the precious vessel. All that host is fled. Now must the hardened helm of hammered gold be stripped of all its trim, the stewards sleep who should have tended to this battle mask. So too this warrior's coat, which weighted once the bite of iron over the crack of boards, moulders like its owner. The coat of mail cannot travel wide with the war chief beside the heroes. Harp joy I have none, no happy song, nor does the well-schooled hawk soar high through the hall, nor the swift horse stamp in the courtyards. Savage butchery has sent forth many of the race of men." And this is heartbreaking, because the last survivor is looking at all this gold and realizing it's no longer of use. All of the men who would have used it now have died. And quite possibly because of the greed of wanting more of this. That might be why the last survivor has actually buried it. Dust to dust, return to the earth what was once the earth's, and basically free men from its control. But some of the wording here actually might hint that the last survivor ultimately became the dragon. This burial mound for the horde might have actually become his burial mound, and then him become the dragon. Now, they say this is sort of separate. So, grieving, he mourned her sorrow alone after all, unhappy sped both days and nights, until the flood of death broke upon his heart. An old beast of the dawn found that shining hoard standing open. That's the dragon coming in. But, death, and then suddenly the dragon appears. Could we be seeing the creation of the dragon through this last survivor? I honestly think so. Because we're seeing this despising of men, this savage butchery that has sent forth many men, and this utter loneliness, which we know the dragon is alone. There is no other dragon in this story. Even Grendel had his mother. But the dragon is fully alone. Just like the last survivor. And then I think, most notably, is the fact that he mentions all the equipment of war and a cup. Now I have none to bear the sword or burnish the bright cup, the precious vessel. Well, we know the thief ultimately grabbed a jeweled cup out of the hoard? Are we seeing the anger of the dragon stirred not for the removal of one piece of all of this gold because he's so greedy, but are we actually seeing somebody who longed for his hall to be full of life and joy, who has now seen death and destruction, and all he has left is the material things? Are we seeing a man at his worst, a dragon who wants to keep what's his because he's lost what's most meaningful already? Are we going to see Beowulf become this creature? There are, well, some hints both ways. So, let's get into that. I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.